Hi there, this is the second part of the 3.01 recording. Starting here in the last paragraph. Urged on by James Madison, who was now a congressman from Virginia, and his fellow Virginian, Thomas Jefferson, President Washington asked that the necessary amendments be drawn up. Madison did so, and the House and Senate quickly approved them in September 1789. The states then ratified 10 of Madison's proposed amendments. Collectively known as the Bill of Rights, these first 10 amendments became part of the Constitution on December 15, 1791. And here are the Bill of Rights, all 10 of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution in the blue. And we'll be covering them in the Class Connect for this lesson, but you certainly should read through them and be familiar with what those Bill of Rights are, what they're about, what they all entail. The Bill of Rights prohibits the federal government from infringing on the rights of free speech and assembly. It also bars the government from establishing an official religion. It affirms the rights of citizens to due process of law and to trial by jury. It protects citizens from unlawful searches and seizures. Madison came around to supporting a Bill of Rights because he knew the people wanted it, but he and his supporters were careful to include two important provisions. The Ninth Amendment explains that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. In other words, the Bill of Rights lists some, but not all of the rights retained by the people. The 10th Amendment declares that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. The Bill of Rights left major questions unanswered. How would the federal and state government divide and share power? What rights did Americans enjoy beyond those listed in the Bill of Rights? Those questions would be the cause of much debate in the following decades, and they remain a source of debate today. So definitely a living, breathing document. Alexander Hamilton heads the Treasury. One of the biggest challenges facing the federal Congress, the first Congress, was the nation's huge burden of debt. Washington's Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, led the effort to set the nation's fiscal house in order. Born in 1755 in the British West Indies, Hamilton was the son of a Scottish merchant and a French woman. Because his parents were not married, Hamilton faced many social obstacles. That he was able to overcome poverty and prejudice was a tribute to his intellectual and political ability, as well as to the opportunities available for men of talent and enterprise in the new republic. Hamilton began his career as an apprentice to a merchant in St. Croix. He earned such high esteem from the island's leaders that several local merchants raised funds to send him to New York. There he attended King's College, later Columbia University. With revolution in the air, young Hamilton joined the Continental Army, hoping to escape the grueling condition of a clerk, to which my fortune, etc., condemns me. It was a life-altering decision. From aide-de-camp to George Washington to field commander, Hamilton performed brilliantly. He was a lieutenant colonel when he was little more than 20 years old. He later served as a member of the Confederation Congress from New York. A strong proponent of the new government, Hamilton co-authored the Federalist Papers with James Madison and John Jay, and helped gain ratification of the Constitution in New York. By the time Washington tapped him to head the new Treasury Department, Hamilton had built a successful law practice. With his piercing blue eyes, his tightly combed shock of reddish blonde hair, and his taste for expensively tailored clothes, Hamilton cut an impressive figure. Born outside the continental United States and thus constitutionally ineligible to run for president, he sought to make the Treasury Secretary the most powerful official in the government after the president. During Washington's first term as president, Hamilton's policies set the new nation on the path to economic stability, though the path itself was bumpy indeed. Hamilton's financial plan. The new United States was deeply in debt. The state governments and Congress had borrowed great sums of money during the Revolutionary War. Foreign nations refused to lend more money to the United States because it seemed to them that the American government had no plan to pay it back. Revolutionary War veterans were still owed money, and many people despaired of being able to collect on the bonds they held from state governments. In January 1790, Hamilton delivered to Congress his first report on the public credit. In this study, he divided America's war debts into three categories: foreign debt owed by the federal government to various European nations and banks; 2, debt owed by the federal government to American citizens who had lent money for the war effort by purchasing government bonds; and 3, debt owed by the individual states to American citizens, also in the form of bonds. Hamilton proposed legislation that would allow the new federal government to combine all of the debt, including the bonds issued by the individual states. Under this plan, citizens would turn in their state bonds in exchange for new federal bonds. Hamilton recommended that the government pay down these debts gradually, offering bondholders interest on their initial investments. In this way, the credit of the government, its ability to continue to borrow from domestic and overseas lenders, would be preserved. Hamilton's bold plan was political as well as financial. By having the United States take on the state's debts, Hamilton was hoping to gain the support of the nation's wealthiest citizens for the new and otherwise shaky central government. Hamilton reasoned that since the government owed these wealthy people the most money, they would support the scheme most likely to repay their wartime bonds. Responses to Hamilton's plan. Some veterans of the Revolution objected to Hamilton's plan. During the war, the states and the Continental Congress had paid many soldiers in government bonds. These paper notes were only as good as the state's ability to pay them back in gold and silver. By the 1780s, when it seemed that the states could not or would not redeem these IOUs, many hard-pressed former soldiers, worried they might lose everything, sold their bonds to financial speculators, people who made risky investments in the hopes of turning a big profit in the future. These speculators bought the bonds for a fraction of their value in gold and silver. They were betting on the likelihood that at some point the government would find a way to pay them for the full value of the bonds. Some congressmen felt that these speculators would be unfairly rewarded by Hamilton's plan to have the federal government take on all the state's debts, since a plan proposed to pay off the bonds at their full value. Other congressmen also opposed Hamilton's proposals. Some states, like Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia, either had small debts or had already worked hard to repay what they owed. Why should their citizens now assume responsibility for repaying the large debts of states such as Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, and South Carolina? Among the chief critics of Hamilton's plan were two Virginians, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, newly returned from France, and Congressman James Madison. In some way, Madison's opposition was surprising. Madison had worked closely with Hamilton in securing ratification of the Constitution. The two men had once enjoyed a warm friendship. Like Hamilton, Madison initially favored a strong federal government. But both Madison and Jefferson were troubled by the idea of rewarding speculators and penalizing states that had paid off their debts. They also feared that Hamilton's plan put too much economic power in the hands of the federal government. At a dinner with two powerful Virginians, Hamilton exercised his considerable powers of persuasion. He warned that if the new federal government failed to establish credit in the eyes of the world, the Union might dissolve. On the other hand, said Hamilton, if Jefferson and Madison were willing to support his plan, he would in turn support locating the nation's permanent national capital on the banks of the Potomac River. Hamilton had dearly hoped that his hometown in New York City would remain the seat of the national government, but he was willing to give up this hope to gain support of his influential colleagues. The two Virginians, eager to have the capital so close to the South, agreed, thus concluding one of the most important dinner parties in American history. Okay, let's switch back here and read some of that blue. How government bonds work. Okay, so let's learn about this so that help you make sense of the financial plan. Federal bonds in the 1790s were much like government savings bonds today. A bond is a government-issued IOU. For example, suppose the Johnsons purchase a savings bond for a gift for their newborn grandson. The bond is valued at $100 and is payable on their grandson's 21st birthday. The Johnsons purchase the bond for $50. When they buy the bond, they are in fact loaning the government $50. Years later, when the bond matures, their grandson turns 21 and cashes in the bond for $100. Why is a $50 bond now worth $100? The bond is worth more than its original purchase price because the government has to pay interest on the money it borrowed from the purchaser of the bond. The same was true of Revolutionary War bonds. The new capital. Few nations had ever built a capital city from scratch. Both Maryland and Virginia donated land to make up the new District of Columbia, but it took time to transform the swamps along the Potomac into a functioning capital. Congress chose Pierre Charles L'Enfant, a French-born American, to design the federal city. L'Enfant, a civil engineer living in New York, had grown up near the magnificent Palace of Versailles, but fought in the Continental Army during the American Revolution. In his plan for the American capital, he harked back to ancient Roman times when the seat of the Republic was Capitoline Hill, and L'Enfant's design the new House and Senate sat at the center of the city, perched atop the highest hill, now called Capitol Hill. Though slave labor helped build the city, L'Enfant was also aided by a free African American, Benjamin Banneker. A skilled mathematician and inventor, Banneker helped survey the District of Columbia. Okay, now Bank of the United States. Hamilton's deal with Madison and Jefferson did not put an end to political feuding. On the contrary, new issues arose that began to sharpen the outlines of competing visions for the future of the United States. In particular, America's leaders divided sharply over a new plan proposed by Hamilton. On December 1790, in his second report on the public credit, Hamilton asked Congress to charter a national bank, the first bank of the United States. Up to this time, there were very few banks in the nation. In Hamilton's vision, the new national bank would hold the government's revenue as well as the gold, silver, and the government bonds of private investors. President Washington, uncertain about whether to sign the bank bill into law, asked his Secretary of State and Treasury for advice. Jefferson argued the Constitution did not specifically authorize Congress to charter a national bank. He saw the bank as a threat to the new republic. So much concentrated financial power, thought Jefferson, would turn the young United States into a mirror image of Britain, where banks, stock markets, and speculators sacrificed the common good to private gain. In response, Hamilton reminded President Washington that the Constitution gave Congress the authority to do whatever was necessary and proper to govern the nation effectively. In the end, Washington agreed with Hamilton and signed the bill. So the necessary and proper is also called the elastic clause in the Constitution. To allow for things that might come up, they made that elastic clause in the Constitution to cover such situations. The bank debate opened up a fundamental disagreement on how to interpret the Constitution. On one hand, there were those who, like Jefferson and Madison, insisted on strictly adhering to the text of the Constitution. These strict constructionists, as they have come to be called, believe the federal government could only assume powers specifically itemized in the Constitution. On the other hand, the loose constructionists like Hamilton argue that the government could assume powers that the Constitution did not specifically prohibit. Hamilton and his followers especially emphasize Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, sometimes called the Necessary and Proper Clause or the Elastic Clause. This clause states that Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States. This clause, said the loose constructionists, gave Congress certain implied powers. But in the eyes of Jefferson and the other strict constructionists, such an interpretation of the Constitution opened the way to abuse of power or even tyranny. Both sides claimed to be faithful to the Constitution. Which side was correct? Since the framers themselves were divided, after all, both Hamilton and Madison had been chief architects of the Constitution, it was unclear just what the document meant, which left the way for continuing debates for years to come. All right, and we'll stop here with this part of the textbook, and let's finish up here in the lesson. Okay, so make sure that you have filled out your reading guide. Look at the money in the bank activity. Thomas Jefferson stressed states' rights, not federal. That's true. Okay, next question. James Madison opposed Hamilton's ideas. That's true. Next, Hamilton wanted a strong federal government. True. No interest was to be paid on the debts. That's false. That was part of the bonds. Hamilton wanted the United States to pay the states' debts. Yes, that's true. To absorb the states' debts into the federal debts. Washington opposed Hamilton's plans. No, he eventually agreed with them. Hamilton wanted to repay the debts gradually. Yes, he did. He wanted to give it time so they wouldn't bankrupt themselves. And that was the last of the questions there in that little review activity. And continuing on. So make sure you finish your reading guide and then do the 301 checkpoint. Best of luck!